Before we begin, understand this. What you're about to hear was never meant for the public. Not in 1851, not in any century before it, and certainly not now. This story comes from a lineage of secrets older than the country you stand in, older than the institutions you trust, older than the chains you think only belong to the past. Picture it, an estate hidden behind cedar trees, a mansion built from stone carried by men who died nameless and unrecorded, a place whispered about in Southern folklore not because of violence, but because of initiation, a place where the true mechanics of power were taught in the dead of night. They called it the Order of Still Minds, a circle of landowners, scholars, and occult natural philosophers who believed the world was a machinery of minds, not governments. They believed control was never about force, only perception, never about punishment, only obedience. And inside that manor lived a woman whose name the official records erased, though the surviving journals describe her with one unnerving detail. She smiled at things no person should ever smile at. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood. The night everything changed, the master of the estate called his household into the cellar, not as prisoners, but as participants. Every door was locked, every lamp extinguished except one. In the center of the room sat a single iron chain, polished like an artifact instead of a weapon. And she, his wife, stepped forward before anyone else could move. She took the chain in her hands. Cold metal, heavy, symbolic, not for restraint, but for revelation. The journals say she whispered only one sentence: "If you want to see the truth, you must let it bind you first." And she smiled, not with defiance, not with madness, but with certainty, because she knew the ritual wasn't meant to test her. It was meant to expose the invisible architecture of power that shapes men, families, nations, and empires. And she was ready to descend, ready to witness, ready to learn what most men spend their whole lives running from: the truth that control must first be experienced, before it can be understood. The cellar door shut with a sound that echoed like the closing of an era. Thick wood, iron hinges, finality. No one dared breathe too loudly. They all felt it, the atmosphere tightening, the air compressing around their ribs, as if the room itself wanted silence. But she stood at the center, chain draped across her palms like a relic. And the strange thing was this: her presence calmed the room, almost as if she had stepped into this ritual before, almost as if she had waited her entire life for this exact moment. The master of the estate, a man recorded only as E.H. Blackthorne, watched her with a mixture of reverence and fear. His journals reveal that the ritual was not originally designed for his wife. It was meant for him, meant to test whether he could confront the architecture of influence that the order believed governed all human behavior. But she stepped forward first. She chose the chain. And the room responded. In the order's teachings, there was a belief: a mind is never truly free until it chooses what others fear. That was the first secret of power. The paradox that breaks weaker men. The foundation of every empire, every dynasty, every king who ever ruled without drawing a sword. She lifted the chain and wrapped one end around her wrist, not tightly enough to harm, but firmly enough to symbolize surrender to truth. Not surrender to a man, not surrender to a ritual, but surrender to reality itself, stripped of the illusions society feeds the masses. Then she raised her eyes, dark, steady, unwavering, and the entire room went still, because the ritual required silence, absolute silence, the kind of silence that reveals what you've been hiding from yourself. Blackthorne lit a single lantern above her head, and its glow carved shadows that danced across the stone floor like old spirits remembering their shapes. He spoke only one line of the initiation: "In this chamber, your mind belongs to truth alone." The chain hummed as she lifted her chin. Some swore the metal warmed in her hands. Some swore they heard whispers behind the walls. No one moved. No one dared. Because they knew what came next. The part of the ritual meant to break a man's identity and rebuild it from the bones of his illusions. And she faced it with a smile. A smile that said, "I'm ready for whatever truth this world has been hiding." The lantern's flame trembled as if reacting to an unseen breath. And with it, the shadows stretched long and thin across the cellar walls. The room felt alive now, watching, listening, waiting. Every person present would later describe the same sensation, as if they were no longer standing in a room, but inside a test designed by something older than them. Blackthorne stepped closer to his wife, but only by a single pace. Any more would have broken the ritual's equilibrium. The order taught that truth had a geometry, an invisible structure that, once disturbed, would distort everything revealed within it. A man could stand too close to truth. A man could stand too far. But she stood perfectly, as though she belonged to it. The chain around her wrist glinted in the lantern's flicker. She closed her eyes, not to retreat inward, but to listen, because in this ritual, sight was considered a liar. Eyes could be manipulated, but the instincts underneath them, those told the real story. Blackthorn spoke again, voice lower now, almost reverent. Reveal the first veil. The witnesses later wrote that the temperature dropped instantly, even though no windows were open, no drafts existed, and the lantern burned strong. A coldness that wasn't physical, but intellectual. The kind of cold a man feels when he realizes the foundation of his beliefs was built on someone else's blueprint. Then, she inhaled. Slow, measured, deliberate. And when she opened her eyes, something had changed. Not her expression, not her posture, but the depth behind her gaze, as if she had just seen a structure behind reality that the rest were too afraid to look at. She whispered the ancient invocation, her voice steady. Truth belongs to no master. The chain tightened, not by her hand, not by Blackthorn, but as if responding to the words themselves. A symbol, a reminder, a warning. And then came the part that broke several men in the years to come, though she absorbed it without a tremor. From the walls, from the silence, from the unspeakable tension in the air, came a low, resonant hum. Not mechanical, not human, something deeper. A sound that pulled at memory, instinct, ego, exposing every false belief a man clings to for stability. A sound meant to dismantle illusions layer by layer. Most people flinch when their worldview cracks. Most look away. Most run. But she didn't. She stared directly into the unseen architecture awakening around her, and the smile returned. Not wide, not manic, just enough to say, "Yes, I was meant to see this." The hum deepened until it felt less like sound and more like something pressing against the inside of every skull in the room. It vibrated through the ribs. It crawled along the spine. It asked questions without language, questions men had spent their whole lives avoiding. Most of the witnesses tried not to panic. A few failed. One man dropped to his knees, gripping his temples as if holding his mind inside his head by force alone. Another backed into the wall, eyes wide, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since childhood. But she stood perfectly still, chain glinting, breath steady, gaze locked on the center of the room where nothing, and yet everything, was happening. Because the ritual was never about ghosts or spirits or dark forces. It was about exposing the mind to the machinery it never sees. Blackthorn opened a leather-bound ledger, one of the forbidden manuscripts of the order, and began reading a passage written in letters that didn't belong to any single language. It wasn't meant to be understood literally. It was meant to bypass the conscious mind and go deeper. He read, "Truth is a structure made of choices. Control is the shadow cast by those who refuse to see it." The lantern flickered violently. The hum sharpened. The air thickened. And then, in the center of the room, a faint distortion formed. Like heat rising from desert sand. Like the world trying to reveal its blueprint but struggling against the limits of human perception. Most looked away. A few shut their eyes altogether. But she leaned in, as if studying a map, as if finding something familiar, as if recognizing a pattern she had known all her life but never had the language to describe. The distortion pulsed. Reality rippled. And for a moment so brief no watch could measure it. She saw it. The hierarchy beneath existence, the invisible architecture that determined who obeyed, who commanded, who followed, and who rose above all of them. A lattice of influence. A spine of hidden authority. A system of minds, not laws. She whispered, "So this is what you've been hiding." Blackthorn stopped reading. The hum choked out. The distortion snapped shut like a door slammed by the universe itself. The room fell deathly silent. And in that silence, everyone felt it. A shift in the balance of power. Because the ritual wasn't revealing truth to her. It was revealing truth through her. And for the first time, Blackthorn realized something the Order had never prepared him for. She wasn't being initiated into the structure. She was becoming part of it. For nearly a minute, no one moved. Not because they were frozen in fear, but because they were afraid to interrupt whatever force had just taken interest in her. The cellar felt different now, charged with a pressure that seemed to originate from her presence, not the ritual itself. Blackthorn's hand trembled as he closed the ledger. He had expected to guide her through the unveiling. He had expected her to struggle, to falter, to cling to him for stability. But instead, she absorbed the revelation like someone returning to a place they'd once lived. He whispered, barely audible, "She's not reacting. She's adapting." The other witnesses exchanged uneasy glances, because in the artist's teachings, the first veil was designed to destabilize a person, to shake their identity, dismantle their assumptions, expose the cracks in their convictions. Even the strongest men required time to recover. Some never recovered at all. But she looked steadier than before, calmer, more anchored. It was as if the revelation had clarified her rather than fractured her, as if she had always sensed the hidden structure beneath life's illusions, and now finally saw its outline. Blackthorn stepped forward, his voice quieter, almost reverent. "What did you see?" She didn't answer at first. Her eyes drifted back to the empty space where the distortion had appeared, studying it, memorizing it. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't shaken. It was measured, like a woman weighing each word against the laws of reality. "The mind obeys stories," she said. "Not truth. Never truth. That is how power survives." A murmur rippled across the room. Not disagreement, recognition. Because they all felt something similar during the unveiling. A loosening of old beliefs, a crack in their mental armor, a glimpse of the machinery behind human obedience. But she was the only one who articulated it. Effortlessly, accurately, dangerously. Blackthorn inhaled sharply, because in that single sentence, she had distilled decades of the Order's secret doctrine, without ever being taught it. And that meant one thing. She wasn't just participating in the ritual. She was synchronizing with it. The chain around her wrist shifted, metal brushing against skin with a sound too soft to be natural. As if acknowledging her. As if choosing her. Her smile returned, small, sharp, and knowing. Blackthorn finally understood what terrified him. The ritual wasn't testing her capacity. It was revealing her nature. And she had just proven she possessed the one quality the Order feared more than any other. A mind that would not break. The silence stretched, heavy as stone. The first veil had been a warm-up, a glimpse into the hidden machinery of obedience and power. But the Order's manuscripts were clear. The second veil was designed not to reveal, but to confront. Not to inform, but to challenge. Not merely the intellect, but the soul. Blackthorn circled her cautiously, the ledger now closed in one hand, the other trembling with a mixture of anticipation and fear. He knew the rules. No one had ever confronted the second veil without faltering. Most men left the chamber broken, their ambitions hollowed, their convictions scattered like ashes in the wind. And yet here she stood. The chain around her wrist clinked softly, a sound sharp against the silence, as though the metal itself were alive. It was a reminder that her choice, the voluntary surrender to observation, was not a show of weakness. It was a statement, and the room seemed to recognize it. "Are you ready?" Blackthorn asked, though the question was rhetorical. He already sensed the answer. She nodded, a subtle tilt of her chin. That one small motion carried centuries of latent defiance, of understanding, of alignment. She had passed the first test simply by standing. Now came the second, far more insidious. From somewhere deep in the walls came a low, resonant vibration, unlike the hum of the first veil. This one penetrated the chest, insinuated itself into the mind. It did not seek to reveal mechanics or hierarchies. It sought to judge, to probe the very foundation of identity, to expose the choices hidden beneath the masks of civility and morality. Blackthorn recited the passage for the second veil, words designed to awaken instinct, dissolve pretense, and confront every hidden desire. He who claims freedom while bound is the first prisoner. He who commands without understanding is the first fool. All who pretend to see the world unshackled are already lost. The vibration grew stronger. The air thickened. Eyes widened. Breaths caught. Most men's knees threatened to buckle. They sensed their deepest lies teetering on the edge of revelation. But she inhaled steadily, the chain swinging gently with the rhythm of her calm, unshakable heartbeat. And when she spoke, it was not in fear, not in resistance, not in obedience. Then I will measure myself against it. The words alone carried weight, reshaping the energy in the room. The second veil did not cower. It did not retreat. It acknowledged her. It seemed to fold around her presence, bending to the mind that would not break. For the first time, Blackthorn realized something impossible. She wasn't just facing the ritual. She was co-creating it. The second veil had begun to hum with a presence far older than Blackthorn himself, a pulse that seemed to draw the very marrow from the bones of those present. Most men would have crumpled under its weight, but she did not. Instead, she stepped closer to the center of the room, chain brushing softly against the stone floor, as if marking territory in a world unseen. The Order's manuscripts warned that the mirror was coming, the part of the ritual no one survived unscathed. They called it the mirror of hidden desire. It was not a literal mirror, but a reflection that manifested inside the mind, exposing truths even the observer had denied to themselves. Every ambition, every fear, every suppressed craving would surface, sharpened by the vibration of the ritual. Blackthorn hesitated. His own reflection, the one that had always projected authority, control, mastery, flickered in the corner of his consciousness. The ledger's pages seemed to tremble as if aware of the impending confrontation. He knew what would happen next. Most men, confronted by the truth of themselves, screamed, collapsed, or swore to erase what they had seen. She, however, breathed steadily. The chain was heavier now, a subtle pressure against her wrist, reminding her of the voluntary submission she had chosen. Every fiber of the ritual sought to crack her identity, yet she remained anchored, rooted in a clarity few men could imagine. The mirror of hidden desire unfolded inside her mind like a map of the invisible forces that guided human behavior. She saw it all, the instincts men used to dominate and deceive, the patterns women wielded to influence and manipulate, the unspoken hierarchy of power that stretched beyond kingdoms and centuries. The vision did not terrify her. It intrigued her. It illuminated. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Desire is never secret, only denied." The vibration intensified. The room seemed to shrink, walls bending inward, pressing minds toward exposure. She saw herself clearly within it, not as a victim, not as a bystander, but as a participant in the machinery of influence itself. Blackthorn faltered. For the first time, he realized that rituals were not meant to control her. They were revealing the architecture of the mind through her. She had become the axis upon which the ritual turned, and as the vibration reached its crescendo, the smile returned, calm, deliberate, unbreakable. She had seen the truth of human desire, and it had not shaken her. She had begun to master it. The cellar air had grown thick, almost tangible, as though the room itself had begun to inhale and exhale with the rhythm of the ritual. The chain around her wrist glimmered faintly in the lantern light, as if acknowledging the energy that now moved through her. Every muscle in her body remained still, yet every nerve seemed alert, awake to a current that few humans could perceive. Blackthorn stood frozen, realizing that the ritual's purpose had shifted. It was no longer merely to test or to reveal. Now it was interacting with her, feeding off her clarity, reacting to her calm. The manuscripts never accounted for someone who could not be shaken. The third phase, the breath of the invisible, began. A vibration unlike any other filled the chamber, a pulse that bypassed the ears entirely, resonating in the chest, the bones, the marrow. It wasn't sound. It was an interrogation, a conversation with forces that did not speak in words but in comprehension. Most men felt the compulsion to flee. Their bodies trembled with anticipation of terror they could not define. But she drew in a slow, deliberate breath. 1, 2, 3. And as her lungs filled, she felt the rhythm of the chamber align with her heartbeat. She became the measure against which the invisible forces judged themselves. Blackthorn's voice faltered as he read from the ledger. To witness the unseen is to become the axis. To breathe with the invisible is to merge with power. Her eyes, calm and sharp, absorbed the shifting shadows. She no longer reacted to the ritual. She orchestrated it from the center of her mind. Every pulse, every vibration, every distortion in the air seemed to bend toward her awareness. And then came the subtle shift, a movement in the space behind perception. Not visible, not audible, but undeniable. The air pressed against the edges of cognition itself, revealing cracks in understanding that had gone unnoticed for lifetimes. She whispered into the vibration, a phrase recorded in the margins of the author's manuscripts but never uttered aloud. I see the threads. I accept their weight. The chain hummed softly. The vibration softened, responding to her acknowledgement. The room fell into a silence heavier than before, one that felt poised on the edge of revelation. For the first time, Blackthorn understood something fundamental. The ritual had never been about obedience or fear. It was about recognition. Recognition of power, not imposed, but inherent. And she had just demonstrated it. Her smile returned. It was not one of triumph or joy, but of comprehension. She had inhaled the invisible, exhaled certainty, and claimed the understanding most men never lived long enough to glimpse. The silence lingered, yet it was alive, vibrating with subtle tension. The first veils had revealed the structure behind obedience. The second had challenged desire and identity. The third, the breath of the invisible, had merged mind with ritual, body with comprehension. But now came the most dangerous lesson of all, the architecture itself. The Order's manuscripts warned that this stage destroyed illusions faster than fear, faster than revelation, faster than any confrontation with mortality. The architecture of influence was not a theory. It was a living, breathing network of intention, manipulation, and silent control, stretching across minds, families, institutions, and empires. Most men never glimpsed it fully. Those who did rarely survived the knowledge intact. She stepped forward, chain clinking softly with each motion. Her gaze was fixed, calm, unwavering. Blackthorn watched, knowing the manuscripts offered no guidance for this moment. Nothing could prepare a man for witnessing someone become the conduit, through which the invisible hierarchy spoke. From the corners of the cellar, the air seemed to ripple, folding and unfolding with a pattern only she could perceive. Every action, every unspoken command, every subtle influence she had encountered in life appeared in crystalline clarity, interwoven into a lattice so vast it could consume the mind. And yet she smiled. The ledger trembled slightly in Blackthorn's hands. He dared not look directly at her. The ritual's energy no longer sought her submission. It sought her recognition, her understanding, her integration into the system. She whispered softly, as if teaching the room itself. Power is not taken. It is received by those who see its design. The vibration returned, not aggressive this time, but confirming, folding around her comprehension. Men in the room staggered as they felt the weight of invisible structures press against their consciousness. Every hidden force, every subtle influence, every silent manipulation became undeniable. She extended a hand lightly, not touching anyone, yet the chain vibrated in response, a symbolic acknowledgement of her alignment. She understood the architecture, not as a victim, not as a pawn, but as an equal participant, an observer who had stepped beyond the threshold most minds never crossed. Blackthorn, reading her recognition in silence, understood the final rule. Knowledge without courage is destructive. Insight without alignment is wasted. Most men would see this lattice and tremble. She had seen it, comprehended it, and smiled. Her smile was not joy. It was comprehension. It was mastery. The cellar's air shifted again, heavier this time, like the weight of centuries pressing down on fragile human understanding. The first revelations had shaken identity. The second had tested desire. The third had merged mind with the invisible. And now came the moment the manuscripts called the oath of alignment, the stage where comprehension demanded action. Blackthorn's voice trembled as he recited the passage. To see the lattice is not enough. To know the architecture is not enough. One must pledge alignment, or remain forever beneath it. She did not flinch. She did not hesitate. The chain around her wrist glinted with a soft metallic hum, acknowledging her choice. She understood that the ritual was not a test of courage alone. It was a measure of willingness, a willingness to integrate understanding with being, to allow comprehension to transform one's presence in the world. She raised her head and spoke with the clarity that had become terrifyingly evident throughout the night. I pledge my awareness. I accept the weight of knowing. I become the axis. The vibration that had haunted the room now coalesced around her. It was not violent. It was confirming, folding in acknowledgement, as though the architecture itself had recognized a mind capable of receiving it without corruption or collapse. Blackthorn and the witnesses felt the shift immediately. The room no longer pressed against them. Instead, it hummed in harmony with her presence. The chain was no longer a symbol of restraint. It had become a conduit, a link between her and the structures she now comprehended. The manuscripts warned that few humans could complete the oath without fracturing. Most who attempted it either rejected alignment or surrendered to fear. She had done neither. She had witnessed, absorbed, and chosen. Her mind had integrated with the lattice in a way the Order had never fully anticipated. Then she spoke again, softly, deliberately, addressing the room in a voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Those who see must act. Those who understand must bear witness. Silence is complicity. Every man in the room felt the implication. Knowledge alone was insufficient. To comprehend was to take responsibility. To survive was to step into a role few dared occupy. And she smiled again, not a smile of triumph, not of cruelty, but of recognition. The ritual had revealed everything it intended to reveal, yet it had also illuminated a deeper truth. The architecture of influence could be mastered, but only by those willing to align themselves with its rhythm, rather than resist it. For the first time, Blackthorn understood the final lesson of the night. The ritual was never about control over others. It was about control over oneself. The oath of alignment had changed the energy of the cellar entirely. The first veils had revealed the hidden structure of obedience. The second had exposed desire and identity. The third had merged perception with invisible forces. The fourth, the oath, had cemented comprehension into being. But the Order's manuscripts hinted at a fifth stage, one far more dangerous, the initiation of shadows. It was not a stage designed to teach. It was a stage designed to confront the self with everything it had ignored, denied, or hidden. Every man carries shadows, suppressed instincts, unspoken fears, unclaimed ambitions. Most men never meet them willingly. Most men run. Those who do confront them rarely emerge the same. She stepped forward, chain glinting faintly, and the vibration in the air deepened again. This was no ordinary sensation. It felt as though the darkness of countless lifetimes pressed against her, probing, testing, seeking fractures in her awareness. Blackthorn, who had guided many through rituals of the Order, watched in disbelief. He had never seen someone endure this stage with composure. Most would be screaming, weeping, clawing at reality. She observed. She engaged. She smiled. The cellar walls seemed to breathe. Shadows detached themselves from corners and surfaces, not as phantoms, but as reflections of the unacknowledged aspects of mind. Each shadow whispered temptations, fears, regrets. The hum now carried voices, fragments of thought, fragments of identity trying to unsettle her. She did not flinch. She did not withdraw. She lifted the chain slightly, a subtle gesture, almost ceremonial. And she spoke. I see you. I know you. You are mine to understand, not to command me. The shadows recoiled as if recognizing the claim of someone unbroken. Their whispers twisted, faltered, and dissolved into the vibration itself. Blackthorn finally understood. The initiation of shadows was not about dominance over others. It was about mastery over oneself. To integrate the unseen, to align with the architecture, one had to confront every suppressed fragment of being. And she had done it flawlessly. She smiled once more. Not with triumph, not with arrogance, but with the serenity of someone who had stared into the deepest recesses of human nature, faced the machinery of influence, and emerged without surrender. Her presence now dominated the room, not by force, but by certainty. The manuscripts whispered that those who completed the initiation of shadows became a fulcrum. They did not merely observe reality. They became a pivot around which perception itself could turn. And she had just claimed that role. The shadows had receded, yet their imprint lingered, like a memory pressed into the air itself. The initiation of shadows had concluded, but the ritual was far from over. The manuscript spoke of a final revelation, one the Order only whispered about, the convergence of perception. It was a stage where comprehension and influence intertwined, where mind that understood the architecture could bend reality itself, not through force, but through presence and alignment. She remained in the center, chains softly clinking, calm, unwavering. Every inch of her posture radiated the quiet authority of someone who had faced every hidden current of power and survived intact. Blackthorn's voice trembled as he addressed her. Do you understand what comes next? She did not answer immediately. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the witnesses who trembled not from fear, but from the realization that they were mere shadows beside her clarity. When she finally spoke, Her voice was measured, precise, and undeniably commanding. The world bends to those who align themselves, not by force, but by understanding. The vibration returned, deeper, richer, more nuanced than any before. It was no longer a test. It was a conversation, a dialogue between a mind that refused to break and the hidden architecture of influence itself. Walls seemed to pulse. The air shimmered. The cellar had become both stage and teacher, and she the fulcrum of its lessons. Blackthorn realized that the convergence was more than mastery of self. It was mastery of perception. To integrate fully meant to see and feel the currents that moved men, institutions, empires. It meant to anticipate action before it unfolded. It meant to exist simultaneously within reality and above it. She extended her free hand subtly. The chain on her wrist glinted in the lantern light, a symbol not of restraint but of connection. The room seemed to shift in response, as if acknowledging that the individual who had faced the veils and shadows now held a new equilibrium, a mind synchronized with a hidden lattice of power. The manuscripts had warned, few survive the convergence without arrogance. Many collapse under the weight of comprehension. But she smiled once more, not a smile of triumph, but of perfect understanding. She had not only witnessed the architecture, she had begun to move within it. Blackthorn whispered in awe. She is no longer subject to the ritual, she is its axis. And in that moment, the witnesses understood the unspoken truth. Knowledge could elevate or destroy. But when aligned, it created a force that reshaped the room, the ritual, and the observer herself. The convergence of perception left the room charged, as though the air itself had been rewritten. Every shadow, every vibration, every pulse of awareness now aligned with her presence. But the ritual was not complete. The manuscripts whispered of the Codex of Unseen Rules, a stage reserved for those who had transcended fear, desire, and perception itself. Hey, the hidden laws of influence, obedience, and power revealed themselves fully, and to witness them was to inherit a dangerous clarity. Blackthorn, still gripping the ledger, stepped cautiously. His eyes betrayed both awe and fear. He understood now that he had never been guiding the ritual. He had been observing it adapt to her. Every syllable of the manuscripts had been a scaffold, and she had dismantled them, bending the structure around her own comprehension. The Codex was invisible. It existed not in ink, not in stone, but in the interactions of thought, intention, and consequence. It was written in choices, in alignment, in the rhythm of human perception. Those who attempted to read it too early saw only chaos. Those who waited, like her, saw patterns, immutable, eternal, and terrifying in their precision. She lifted her eyes and whispered, almost inaudibly, as though speaking to the lattice itself, "Everything has a rule. Every action, every reaction. The invisible governs the visible, and the world bends to understanding, not force." The vibration returned, softer now, affirming her words. The walls seemed to pulse in recognition, the shadows stretching one last time before retreating. The witnesses felt the weight of the Codex settle in their minds, but only her presence could bear it fully. Every hidden law, every subtle manipulation, every silent hierarchy made itself known, but she processed it as a scholar, a strategist, a master of alignment. Blackthorn whispered, almost reverently, "She has become more than participant. She is interpreter." She smiled, chain brushing lightly against her wrist. The smile was quiet, knowing, anchored in comprehension. She had transcended observation and ritual. She had internalized the Codex. She now carried the blueprint of influence within her mind, capable of seeing where others could only guess, anticipating currents of power invisible to the untrained eye. And in that silent acknowledgement, every man in the room understood the danger and the potential. Knowledge could destroy, or it could forge. She had chosen the latter. She had become the axis upon which perception and power converged. The manuscripts remained closed. Their secrets were no longer external. They lived in her understanding, and in that understanding, the true ritual had reached its apex. With the Codex now absorbed into her awareness, the cellar felt both heavier and lighter at once. The hum, the vibration, the shadows, all had retreated, leaving a profound stillness that pressed against the consciousness of every witness. Yet she was not still. She had reached the threshold of influence, the penultimate stage of the ritual, where comprehension transforms into subtle authority. The manuscripts described this stage in vague, fearful terms. Few humans were capable of reaching it without arrogance consuming them. Hey, knowledge ceases to be passive. It becomes a force that resonates through intention, presence, and perception. A single thought can ripple outward, altering decisions, influencing choices, and shaping outcomes without a word spoken. This was the invisible leverage, the ultimate power of those who understand the hidden lattice of reality. She stepped forward deliberately, chain brushing softly against the floor. Each movement seemed measured to match the rhythm of the cellar itself. The vibration, once external, now felt internal, her heartbeat in harmony with the architecture of influence. Blackthorn, trembling, finally asked, "Do you feel it?" She did not answer immediately. She surveyed the room, observing the subtle shifts in posture, the micro-expressions, the unspoken hesitation in every man present. And then, her voice, calm and steady, cut through the silence. "It is not a feeling. It is comprehension. It is knowing the consequences before they manifest. It is seeing the hidden currents beneath all decisions." The chain vibrated faintly, a soft acknowledgement of alignment. This was no longer a ritual about obedience, revelation, or endurance. It was about the mastery of subtle force, where influence requires no coercion, only awareness. The witnesses felt it instinctively. The air seemed to bend around her presence. Decisions they had made moments before now felt secondary, as if they were being subtly recalibrated by something beyond the visible. The manuscripts whispered that the threshold of influence is the moment when perception and action converge, when the observer becomes a fulcrum of unseen authority. She smiled once more, a quiet, unwavering curve of comprehension. She had moved from participant to axis, from witness to conduit. Blackthorn exhaled, understanding the unspoken truth. Few could survive this stage. Fewer still could maintain integrity under its weight. And she had not just survived. She had claimed the threshold, bending perception without force, mastering influence without assertion. The ritual had one final stage remaining. One last descent into forbidden knowledge awaited. The threshold of influence had revealed the contours of unseen authority, but now the ritual demanded the ultimate comprehension, the axis of power. Hey, knowledge ceases to be merely understood. It becomes intrinsic. It becomes the lens through which reality itself is perceived and subtly guided. The manuscript described it only in fragments, warnings scrawled in margins, lines of text deliberately obscured, for the living rarely survived what it revealed. She stood in the center of the cellar, the chain around her wrist now a symbol of her voluntary alignment with forces too deep for most minds to grasp. The air hummed faintly, responding to her presence, bending subtly as if the architecture itself recognized her as its axis. Blackthorn felt the shift immediately, an almost gravitational pull toward her comprehension. He realized in a heartbeat that the ritual was no longer external. It was internal. She had become the pivot point through which all unseen currents converged. From the shadows, whispers emerged. Not voices, not sound, but impressions. These were the currents of influence, patterns of ambition, fear, loyalty, and deception woven together over decades, centuries, lifetimes. Most men could see fragments at best, and only at great cost. She perceived the lattice in its entirety, the lines of power, the silent forces guiding decisions in distant chambers, courts, and boardrooms. She inhaled deliberately, chain brushing softly against the floor, and exhaled in perfect synchronization with the invisible forces. And then she spoke, softly but deliberately. All power is a reflection of understanding. All influence begins with perception. To stand at the axis is to embody both. The vibration in the room deepened, almost imperceptible yet undeniable. Witnesses felt their own thoughts recalibrating, micro-decisions bending toward alignment with her presence. She had not commanded them, and yet the room acknowledged her authority. Blackthorn realized the truth he had long ignored. The ritual had never been about breaking her. It had been about revealing the mind capable of mastering the hidden architecture. The chain was no longer a symbol of restraint. It was a conduit connecting her insight to the lattice itself. She smiled, faintly, knowingly. Not arrogance, not triumph, but comprehension of the magnitude of what she now held. The manuscripts whispered in silence. Few stand at the axis. Fewer endure its weight. And she had not only stood, she had become the center around which unseen power flowed. The final stage remained, a revelation deeper than mastery, a descent into the forbidden truths that shaped not only minds but destiny itself. The axis of power had revealed the full lattice of unseen influence, yet the ritual held one final stage, the revelation beyond control. This was the apex, the forbidden knowledge few dared acknowledge, the insight that separated observers from architects. It was the stage where understanding becomes existential, where mastery is no longer about influence, it is about the comprehension of inevitability itself. The cellar felt different now, almost sacred. The vibrations of the previous stages had merged with her own pulse. The chain around her wrist was no longer an object. It was a symbol, a bridge between human awareness and the machinery that had always guided civilizations. Blackthorn's voice faltered as he recited the manuscripts one last time. To see the architecture is to know its laws. To comprehend fully is to perceive inevitability. The mind that masters this does not command. It aligns. It witnesses. It exists at the fulcrum of destiny. She closed her eyes briefly. The world of perception shifted. Every subtle current, every hidden decision, every whisper of intent across time and space became visible, not as separate actions, but as an interconnected web of cause and effect. Every choice made by men, empires, institutions, even the invisible forces guiding history, now seemed like threads she could trace and anticipate. She inhaled, slowly, deliberately, and when she exhaled, she spoke, not to the room, but to the architecture itself. I am neither master nor servant. I am the observer. I am the axis. I am aligned. The vibration responded, softening into a resonance of completion. The shadows, the whispers, the currents, they all acknowledged her presence. She had seen the hidden truth. Control is an illusion. Influence is a reflection. The only reality is alignment with the forces that shape men, institutions, and destinies alike. Blackthorn felt a mixture of awe and terror. The manuscripts had never prepared him for this. Few who reached the final stage could comprehend it without fracturing. She had not fractured. She had integrated. Her smile returned, calm, unwavering, almost imperceptible. It was a smile of comprehension beyond fear, beyond desire, beyond the need for dominance. She had glimpsed the forbidden truths that most men spend lifetimes ignoring, and she had absorbed them without surrender. The ritual was complete. The cellar, once a chamber of tests, was now a crucible of revelation. And she had emerged, not broken, not altered, but fundamentally elevated, aligned with the hidden currents of power and understanding that few could ever perceive. The ritual had concluded, yet the energy in the cellar did not dissipate. It lingered, a tangible presence, resonating with the minds of every witness. The first veils had tested identity, the second desire, the third perception, the fourth alignment, the fifth shadows, the sixth influence, and the seventh inevitability. And now, in the wake of her final ascent, something unprecedented had occurred. The transformation was imprinted, not only upon her, but upon all who observed it. Blackthorn, normally composed, felt it first. His thoughts shifted subtly, his perception bending, his instincts aligning with the patterns he could now sense but barely understand. He tried to speak, to reclaim authority, but words failed. The ritual had not just elevated her, it had altered the psychological gravity of the room. Every man present now existed in reference to her comprehension, whether they realized it or not. She remained calm, chain resting lightly on her wrist. Her gaze swept over the room, not with judgment, not with superiority, but with clarity. The chain, once a symbol of restraint, now reflected mastery. It shimmered subtly in the lantern light, acknowledging the transformation she had absorbed and the influence she now radiated effortlessly. Whispers of the codex, of the veils, of the lattice, and of the shadows began to resonate silently in the minds of those who watched. Those who had resisted, who had feared, who had clung to illusions, now felt a subtle recalibration. Their instincts, their judgments, their comprehension of power, they had been forever altered. She spoke finally, soft, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Knowledge alone does not change the world. Alignment does. Witness it. Understand it. Carry it. Her words were not commands. They were the imprint of comprehension, and the room absorbed them. Men who had doubted, who had feared, who had trembled, now carried fragments of insight, though none could claim to fully understand it. They had been witnesses to a force beyond ordinary perception, a mind aligned with the architecture that had shaped history and destiny alike. Blackthorn finally understood the danger, the magnitude, the irreversible weight of what had occurred. She was no longer simply a participant in the ritual. She was its living fulcrum, a mind that could see, integrate, and influence without ever raising a hand. And in doing so, she had imprinted a shadow of that mastery upon all who had observed. Her smile, faint but unwavering, lingered, an echo that would haunt the thoughts and ambitions of everyone in the room for the rest of their lives. The cellar was silent, yet heavy with the echoes of what had transpired. The ritual, once thought to be a series of tests, was complete. She had passed every stage, integrated every veil, aligned with the unseen currents of power, and become the axis of influence itself. But there was a final truth, one the manuscripts warned of but never fully explained. Every elevation carries a consequence, not always visible, not always immediate, but inevitable. The witnesses, men who had once believed themselves masters of observation, felt it first. Their thoughts no longer moved solely under their own direction. A subtle gravitational shift had occurred, one anchored by her presence. Decisions, judgments, instincts, they now reverberated in reference to her. It was not coercion. It was alignment. Subtle, unavoidable, permanent. Blackthorn, the man who had orchestrated the ritual, finally understood the cost of comprehension. To witness mastery without surrendering to fear was rare. To witness mastery without breaking under its psychological weight was almost impossible. And yet here she stood, chain glinting softly, calm, deliberate, unshakable. She spoke, voice low and commanding, not to demand, but to illuminate. The architecture of power bends around those who understand it. To see is not to control. To align is to become unavoidable. Remember this. Every word resonated like a pulse through the room, embedding itself in the minds of all who listened. The witnesses had seen the forbidden truths of influence, hierarchy, and hidden control. They had felt the invisible currents of desire and obedience, the lattice that guided men, empires, and destinies. And now, they carried that knowledge, but it was no longer neutral. It was forever anchored by her alignment, forever referencing her presence, forever a shadow of her comprehension. Her smile returned, calm, faint, knowing. Not joy, not triumph, not malice, simply the comprehension of consequence. She had absorbed what no ordinary mind could bear. She had aligned with what most could never see, and she had emerged as the fulcrum through which hidden currents flowed. Blackthorn exhaled, a shiver running down his spine. He understood at last, the ritual was not about breaking her. It had always been about revealing the capacity for mastery, about exposing those rare minds capable of integrating forbidden knowledge without surrender. And she was the living proof. The cellar remained silent, the chain resting softly against her wrist. And in that silence, the ultimate truth settled into every observer. Knowledge is power, but mastery of unseen forces imprints itself on all who witness it, for life itself becomes aligned to the axis of understanding. Her eyes met theirs once more, calm, unwavering. The ritual was over. The consequence was eternal. The cellar had quieted, yet the impact of what had transpired was far from over. Every man present felt it, though none could articulate it. The ritual had not ended. It had merely begun to cast shadows over their very minds. Knowledge, once glimpsed, could not be unlearned. And now, that knowledge lingered, like a spectral echo pressing against their consciousness. She remained at the center, chain glinting softly, eyes calm, deliberate, unshakable. Her mastery of the veils, shadows, and the axis of power had left an indelible mark. And that mark extended beyond herself. It touched everyone who had borne witness. Each observer carried a fragment of forbidden understanding, a shard of the lattice of influence that now nested within their minds. The manuscripts had warned of this. To witness fully was to inherit the responsibility of insight. Most would be consumed by it. A few, like her, would integrate it. But even integration carried consequences. The knowledge acted like a silent predator, shaping perception, subtly recalibrating judgment, forcing a constant awareness of hidden currents previously invisible. Blackthorn felt it first. The ledger trembled in his hands, though he had not moved. Every instinct, every reaction, felt drawn toward her, bent subtly around her comprehension. Decisions he had thought autonomous now seemed like faint echoes, aligned against a force he could neither see nor resist. She spoke softly, deliberately, her voice threading through the tension. What is seen cannot be unseen. The shadow of comprehension touches all who look. Do not mistake inheritance for mastery. Alignment is earned, not gifted. Her gaze swept the room. Men instinctively shifted, feeling the subtle weight of observation pressing upon them. It was a psychic gravity, an invisible tether linking them to the fulcrum she had become. The chain, once a tool of restraint, now symbolized continuity. Each clink a reminder that what had been revealed would linger long after the ritual ended. The shadow of legacy was not visible. It could not be measured or quantified, but it existed, in subtle recalibrations of thought, in the quiet reshaping of perception, in the barely perceptible bending of instinct. Every observer carried it now, and it would echo through their actions, decisions, and judgments in ways they would only slowly comprehend. She smiled faintly. Not triumph, not malice, just awareness. The shadow of her mastery had been cast, and it would not fade. The shadow of legacy stretched beyond the cellar walls, invisible yet undeniable. What had been confined to stone and timber now reached into the broader lattice, the hidden architecture of influence that threaded through families, institutions, empires, and even the unseen patterns of human behavior. She could feel it, subtle yet omnipresent, vibrating along currents invisible to all but her attuned mind. Each observer, still reeling from the imprint of the ritual, had become a node in this lattice. Their perceptions subtly realigned, decisions quietly influenced, instincts recalibrated. She watched the effects ripple outward, not through force, but through the alignment of comprehension. Every movement, every glance, every choice began to follow patterns that she understood intimately, patterns that had existed long before the cellar, long before the ritual, and would endure long after. Blackthorn felt it with a chill. The ledger trembled, a silent acknowledgement that the knowledge had leapt beyond its pages. He realized that the lattice was alive, not metaphorically, but in the very way consciousness and influence intertwined. Those who had witnessed her mastery were no longer mere observers, they were conduits, carriers of fragments of a system most would never perceive in its entirety. She extended her hand subtly, chain glinting softly, as though touching threads no one else could see. And in that gesture, the currents pulsed, confirming her position not as a participant, but as the fulcrum of alignment. Every hidden rule, every unspoken law, every silent force of obedience and influence bent subtly around her awareness. Her voice, calm and deliberate, filled the room. The lattice is not confined to walls, nor to the minds of those present. It stretches, eternal, woven through every decision, every ambition, every hidden choice. To understand it is to see what guides the world, and to align with it is to survive within it. The room seemed to shiver with the weight of this realization. The witnesses felt it instinctively, the currents they had ignored, the patterns they had overlooked, the unseen strings that had always tugged at human action. They now existed in a new context, measured against a presence, refracted through the shadow of mastery she had cast. She smiled faintly, eyes calm. The lattice was no longer abstract. It was living. It was responsive. And she, perfectly aligned, had become the axis through which it flowed. The lattice stretched beyond the cellar, yet its influence was not impersonal. Every observer had become a living node, a subtle link in a chain that threaded through consciousness itself. Each mind, still grappling with the shadow of legacy, now carried fragments of her mastery, and though none could see it, the chain had begun to form. Silent, invisible, irreversible. She moved deliberately, chain brushing softly against her wrist, a quiet rhythm echoing the connection she now maintained. Every glance, every motion, every measured breath reinforced the subtle tether linking her to each observer. It was not coercion. It was alignment, an energetic acknowledgement that her comprehension had become a fulcrum upon which perception now turned. Blackthorn felt it most clearly. He tried to assert his own understanding, to cling to authority, but the invisible tether pulled subtly, insidiously. Decisions he had thought autonomous now referenced a presence, subtly bent toward alignment with the currents she now mastered. Each man in the room experienced the same recalibration. The chain of witnesses was no metaphor. It was a psychological reality, and it could not be broken. Her voice cut through the tension, calm yet deliberate. Every eye that witnesses the fulcrum carries its weight. Every mind that perceives the architecture becomes a node in its network. You are no longer mere observers. You are linked. The chain itself seemed to hum softly, responding to her awareness. Observers felt a shift in their instincts, a subtle reshaping of perception that they could not explain. It was the echo of mastery imprinted onto their consciousness, a silent, permanent alignment with her axis. She smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but knowingly. The chain of witnesses extended beyond the cellar. Its threads would stretch across time and space, influencing choices, behavior, and perception in ways subtle, imperceptible, yet unavoidable. The manuscripts had warned of this stage, but they had never fully captured the psychological weight of becoming part of her chain. Few could survive the realization that comprehension itself binds, that awareness carries obligation, and that witnessing mastery carries its own subtle form of surrender. And she had made it clear. The chain was permanent. The alignment could not be revised. Every observer now bore the imprint of her presence, and through them, the lattice of influence expanded, growing ever more intricate, ever more inescapable. The chain of witnesses had formed, invisible yet undeniable, threading through the minds of all who had seen her mastery. But the ritual had more to reveal. Beyond alignment, beyond observation, there existed silent currents, forces that moved unseen, shaping decisions, steering behavior, and whispering direction into the unconscious mind. Few humans perceived them, and fewer still could interact with them consciously. She stood perfectly still, chain resting lightly on her wrist, yet the currents pulsed around her as if drawn to her awareness. Each observer felt a subtle shift in perception. Thoughts they believed were their own now wavered, subtly redirected by patterns they could not articulate. Their instincts bent around her comprehension, acknowledging a mind that had mastered both the lattice and the shadows within themselves. Blackthorn, trying to record every detail in the ledger, realized the currents were not external. They were reflected within each observer. Every whisper of influence, every hidden rule, every silent tug on human behavior had become visible to her, measurable in instinct, in hesitation, in the subtlest micro-movements. And with each measurement, she integrated the patterns, aligning herself more perfectly with the unseen forces. Her voice, soft but carrying a weight beyond the audible, threaded through the room. The world is moved not by commands, but by currents unseen. Those who perceive them can align, anticipate, and guide without ever speaking. Those who cannot are moved by them unknowingly, their lives bending to patterns they do not see. The vibration in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniable. Each observer felt it as a subtle gravitational pull on thought, a quiet recalibration of perception. They were aware, without awareness, that their understanding and instincts were now quietly tethered to her mastery. She smiled faintly, knowingly. The silent currents were no longer invisible to her. She could detect them, anticipate them, and, if necessary, integrate them into her will. Yet she did so not by force, but by alignment. Influence had become as natural to her as breathing. The manuscripts had hinted at this stage, describing it in cryptic passages. He who masters the currents masters the unseen. She now embodied it. Every decision, every hesitation, every impulse of those around her subtly reflected her understanding. The silent currents had become a map. She was its navigator, and every observer, willingly or not, was now part of the voyage. The silent currents were no longer whispers. They had begun to ripple forward, extending their influence into possibilities yet unrealized. This was the mirror of futures, the stage where comprehension stretched beyond the present, where the lattice of influence intersected with time itself. She could sense trajectories, paths that choices might follow, outcomes that decisions could create. The future, once unknowable, was now visible to her, refracted through the architecture she had mastered. Every observer felt it subtly, though none fully grasped it. Decisions made in the past seemed to echo forward, as if the room itself were a nexus of cause and consequence. Choices they had once believed were autonomous now revealed themselves as threads in a greater pattern, threads subtly aligned with her awareness. The shadow of mastery had extended beyond the moment, touching what had yet to occur. She moved deliberately, chain brushing softly against the floor, a rhythm echoing through perception itself. Her gaze scanned the room, not at the individuals, but at the intersections, the points where intention met possibility. Blackthorn shivered, realizing that foresight was not prediction. It was comprehension, the ability to perceive potential and understand which currents could be influenced, which could not. Her voice, calm and deliberate, filled the chamber, The future is not fixed. It is a reflection of alignment. Those who perceive the currents can anticipate, guide, and respond. Those who do not are carried along, unaware of the patterns that govern their lives. The air seemed to hum with the potential of possibilities. Every subtle hesitation, every instinctive movement of the witnesses, was now mirrored in the lattice of futures she perceived. Choices were refracted through her understanding, as though the architecture itself responded to her awareness. She smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with comprehension. The mirror of futures had revealed what few could survive, the perception of consequence beyond time. Every observer, every node in the chain, now carried a subtle awareness of their potential paths, but filtered through her axis. Blackthorn whispered to himself, almost inaudibly, "She doesn't see the future, she sees the alignment of all possibilities." And in that realization, the psychological gravity of her mastery deepened. To observe her was to confront inevitability, yet with the possibility of alignment. The mirror of futures had been unveiled, and the descent into forbidden knowledge continued, each revelation more profound, more dangerous, and more transformative than the last. The mirror of futures had revealed the lattice of possibility, but with revelation came gravity. Knowledge, once glimpsed, was never neutral. It bore weight, subtle, unrelenting, existential. Every observer, every node in the chain, now carried fragments of comprehension they could not fully grasp. And with each fragment came an imperceptible burden, the awareness of patterns, hierarchies, and influence that most minds were never meant to perceive. She stood in the center, chain resting lightly on her wrist, calm, deliberate. The burden was hers to bear as well, but she carried it with the precision of someone aligned, not crushed. Every insight, every subtle pattern she perceived, every whisper of unseen currents added layers to her awareness. The weight was immense, but it reinforced her axis. It demanded vigilance, comprehension, and an unflinching will. Blackthorn, attempting to write, felt the gravity more immediately. Thoughts he once considered autonomous now twisted subtly, shadowed by patterns he could sense but not fully measure. Every instinct, every decision, carried the echo of her mastery. The manuscripts had warned of this. Knowledge of the lattice carries consequences. To witness mastery is to inherit responsibility, whether one desires it or not. Her voice, low and deliberate, cut through the silence. Knowledge is never free. To perceive the architecture is to bear it. Every insight comes with a shadow. Every alignment carries consequence. Few can endure it without fracture. The air vibrated, subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the room itself acknowledged the truth of her words. Witnesses shivered, not from fear alone, but from the dawning awareness that their understanding had been forever altered. Their perceptions, their judgments, their instincts were now shadows of her alignment, calibrated by the fulcrum she had become. She smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but knowingly. The weight of knowledge did not bend her, it anchored her, and it would anchor those who had observed her, each one carrying the subtle imprint of comprehension, forever aware of currents and patterns most would never perceive. Blackthorn whispered, half in awe, half in dread, "We are changed forever." The weight of knowledge was not punishment, it was alignment, and with alignment came the realization that comprehension alters reality, subtly but permanently, in ways the uninitiated could neither understand nor resist. The weight of knowledge settled into every mind, but it did not rest quietly. It resonated, vibrating subtly through the consciousness of all present, a silent echo of the forbidden truths they had witnessed. This was the resonance of fear, not the terror of immediate danger, but the slow, creeping awareness that comprehension itself could unknife, destabilize, and recalibrate perception. She stood at the center, chain resting lightly against the floor, eyes calm yet piercing. The observers felt the tension in her presence, but it was not a threat. It was recognition, a force of alignment they could not ignore. Every instinct, every hesitation, every silent judgment now resonated with the architecture she had mastered. Fear was no longer external. It was internal, woven into the very act of perception. Blackthorn shivered, realizing the subtle shift in his own mind. Every decision he had made moments ago now felt filtered, aligned, refracted through her mastery. The resonance was invisible yet undeniable, a vibration that threaded through instinct, thought, and intuition. It was a reminder that mastery was not only knowledge, it was the power to unsettle, to shape, and to influence without a word spoken. Her voice broke the silence, soft but commanding. Fear is a compass. It signals what cannot be ignored, what is misaligned, what lies beyond comprehension. To understand it is to navigate it, to bend it, and to move within it. The air itself seemed charged. Every witness felt the subtle shift, a quiet tremor beneath thought and sensation. The resonance extended outward, threading through perception like a hidden current, touching decisions, instincts, and judgments. Even those who tried to resist it found themselves subtly realigned. She smiled faintly, knowingly. This resonance was neither punishment nor power. It was consequence. The observers were now attuned, whether they realized it or not, to currents they could not see and patterns they could barely measure. Fear had become a guide, a quiet alignment, a whisper of truth echoing through their awareness. Blackthorn whispered, almost inaudibly, "She bends reality, without moving a finger." The resonance of fear confirmed the depth of the transformation. Mastery, comprehension, and alignment were not passive. They reverberated through the consciousness of all who witnessed them, reshaping perception and subtly asserting influence long after the ritual had ended. The resonance of fear had settled, embedding subtle shifts into the minds of all who observed her. Yet the ritual's influence extended further. The next stage, the silent alignment, was not about observation or comprehension alone. It was about the imperceptible weaving of influence, the quiet shaping of outcomes without a single overt action. She remained at the center of the cellar, chain glinting softly under the lanterns, posture calm, presence undeniable. Every observer felt the pull of alignment, their instincts and judgments bending subtly in response to her awareness. Decisions they believed were independent now carried the faint imprint of her comprehension. Every choice, every hesitation, every glance began to align, not by command, but through the quiet inevitability of perception calibrated by mastery. Blackthorn felt it first. He reached for the ledger, yet his thoughts faltered. The words he intended to write shifted, reshaped, refracted through currents he could not fully perceive. He realized, with a chill, that alignment did not require force. Awareness alone could bend the room, the observers, and the future with quiet precision. Her voice, soft and deliberate, threaded through the space. Alignment is silent. It cannot be measured by gestures, nor understood through observation alone. It moves beneath awareness, threading through thought and instinct until perception itself bends toward equilibrium. The observers felt the subtle recalibration. The room seemed to breathe in synchrony with her presence. Even without movement, even without command, the architecture of influence responded, bending to her axis. Decisions that had seemed autonomous now shifted imperceptibly, as if an invisible hand had guided them toward alignment. She smiled faintly, knowingly. The silent alignment was complete. Influence had become second nature, not through coercion, not through threat, but through mastery of perception itself. Every observer had become a node in her expanding lattice, each mind subtly realigned, each instinct calibrated to the rhythm of her awareness. The manuscripts had hinted at this stage, cryptically, as the pinnacle of subtle power. She had internalized it. And in that stillness, every witness understood a terrifying truth. Mastery need not be loud to be absolute. Its imprint is quiet, enduring, and inescapable. Blackthorn whispered, almost reverently, "She doesn't command, she aligns." The silent alignment had begun to ripple beyond the cellar, setting the stage for the ripple of mastery, where influence spreads outward into the world beyond observation. The silent alignment had settled, embedding subtle recalibrations into every mind present. Yet mastery does not remain confined to a single space. It radiates, extends, and manifests, an invisible force shaping decisions, behaviors, and perceptions beyond its origin. This was the ripple of mastery, the stage where influence escapes observation, weaving itself into the currents of the world without a single overt gesture. She remained calm, chain resting lightly against the floor, yet her presence carried the weight of inevitability. The observers, now nodes in her lattice, felt their instincts and judgments subtly bending, reflecting the rhythm of her comprehension. Every decision, small or large, carried the faint imprint of her awareness, resonating in ways they could barely perceive. Blackthorn shivered, understanding the subtle horror of what was occurring. His own intentions, his own perception of control, were no longer entirely his own. Each thought carried echoes of her mastery, extending beyond the cellar, quietly reshaping behavior, subtly nudging outcomes toward a lattice he could only begin to sense. Her voice, soft and deliberate, carried the quiet authority of inevitability. Mastery is not declared. It ripples. It moves unnoticed, shaping currents and influencing paths, bending outcomes without a word. Those who perceive it are changed, whether they know it or not. The ripple extended further than anyone could observe. Outside the cellar, decisions in distant rooms, unseen interactions, unnoticed gestures, all became subtly aligned to the architecture she now commanded. The observers could sense it subconsciously, a faint tension and instinct, a shadow of inevitability. And though they were unaware of the full scale, the lattice had begun to expand exponentially. She smiled faintly, knowingly, as if acknowledging the vastness of her influence. The ripple was unstoppable. It did not rely on fear, coercion, or force. It depended on awareness, on alignment, on mastery internalized and reflected outward. Every action, every micro-decision of those present, and through them, countless others, was now subtly informed by her axis of comprehension. Blackthorn whispered, almost in awe. It spreads, without a touch, without a command. The ripple of mastery had begun. Influence no longer belonged to her alone. It traveled silently, endlessly, through nodes she had aligned, bending reality in subtle yet permanent ways. The next stage awaited, the burden of the axis, where the true cost of absolute comprehension would reveal itself. The ripple of mastery had extended beyond the cellar, yet with its expansion came an immutable truth. Mastery carries weight. This was the burden of the axis, the stage where absolute comprehension isolates, where alignment with hidden currents demands vigilance, and where the responsibility of knowing far exceeds the ease of power. She stood in the center, chain resting lightly on her wrist, calm yet fully aware of the gravity of her position. To hold the axis of influence was not to dominate. It was to carry the lattice of perception, the web of currents, the silent echoes of possibility, entirely and continuously. The burden was subtle but relentless, pressing on mind and instinct alike, a constant reminder that mastery is as much responsibility as it is power. Blackthorn, still trembling from the previous stages, recognized it first. The room seemed heavier, not with sound or motion, but with the weight of her awareness. Every observer now existed in relation to her axis, their thoughts and actions bending imperceptibly toward alignment. They had become carriers of a lattice they could barely comprehend, and in doing so, shared a fraction of her burden. Her voice, low and deliberate, filled the cellar. To hold the axis is to bear all currents. Alignment is not freedom, it is vigilance. Mastery isolates, not to punish, but to preserve comprehension. Few can endure it. Few are still without surrendering themselves to fracture. The air vibrated faintly, an imperceptible echo of unseen forces, as if the cellar itself acknowledged the truth of her words. Observers felt a subtle heaviness in their thoughts, a quiet tension in their instincts. The weight of comprehension had begun to seep into them, a reminder that knowledge alters perception permanently. She smiled faintly, knowingly. The burden was not weakness, it was awareness, responsibility, and the unrelenting gravity of insight. Every ripple, every alignment, every observer now carried a shadow of this burden, a reflection of what it truly meant to stand at the axis. Blackthorn whispered, awed and unnerved, she carries it all, and still stands. The burden of the axis was complete. Mastery had a cost, and she bore it fully. The final stages awaited, the eternal observation and the consequence beyond time, where comprehension, alignment, and influence would reach their apex, and the imprint on every witness would become permanent and unalterable. The burden of the axis had settled, yet her role was far from over. This stage, the eternal observation, was the culmination of mastery, the understanding that to hold the axis is to exist perpetually as witness, fulcrum, and anchor of the unseen currents that shape the world. Time itself became secondary, a backdrop against which perception and comprehension persisted. She stood perfectly still, chain resting lightly against the floor, eyes calm but unyielding. Every observer felt it. The room seemed to stretch, elongate, and suspend. Instincts, decisions, and microperceptions all bent subtly toward her awareness. The chain of witnesses was now fully integrated into the lattice, each mind reflecting fragments of her comprehension. The weight of observation, of alignment, of inevitable consequence, pressed not just on her, but on all who had seen her mastery. Blackthorn shivered, understanding the finality of this stage. Observation was no longer passive. To perceive her fully was to carry her axis forward, even unconsciously. Every instinct, every fleeting thought, every future action of the witnesses would now carry echoes of her awareness. They had become conduits, permanently tuned to the subtle current she commanded. Her voice, calm, deliberate, and resonant, filled the cellar. To observe the axis is to participate in its eternity. Comprehension does not end with perception. Every witness becomes a node, every alignment becomes permanent, and every action reflects what is seen. You are now part of the lattice. The air itself seemed to pulse with recognition. Observers felt the gravity of their new reality. Knowledge was no longer optional, influence no longer silent. The subtle imprint of her mastery had entered their minds and instincts, establishing a permanent connection that could not be severed. She smiled faintly, knowingly, not with triumph, but with comprehension. The eternal observation was not dominance. It was alignment with inevitability, an unblinking awareness of the lattice of influence and possibility. Every moment became an act of witnessing, every choice an echo of her axis. Blackthorn whispered, almost reverently, "She sees all, and all that sees her is forever changed." The eternal observation established a truth that would endure. Mastery is perpetual, alignment irreversible, and comprehension eternal. The final revelation remained, the consequence beyond time, where every ripple, every alignment, and every witness would face the ultimate imprint of her mastery. The eternal observation had cemented her mastery, yet the final stage remained, the consequence beyond time. This was not about power, alignment, or foresight. It was about the irreversible imprint left on reality itself. Every observer, every node in her lattice, every subtle influence radiating outward would carry her awareness indefinitely, subtly bending perception, decisions, and outcomes long after the cellar had fallen silent. She stood at the center, chain resting softly on her wrist, calm, deliberate, an axis of inevitability. The room felt heavier than ever, not with sound, but with the weight of comprehension. Observers, now permanently linked to her awareness, felt subtle currents tugging at thought and instinct. Every choice they would ever make, every micro-decision, every hesitation carried the shadow of her alignment. Blackthorn whispered, trembling, "It doesn't end, it never ends." The ripple of mastery, the silent alignment, the resonance of fear, all of it had led to this, a permanent recalibration of perception. Each witness had become a subtle vector, carrying fragments of her understanding, spreading them unknowingly, touching decisions, influencing paths, shaping lives. The consequences were invisible but absolute. Her voice, calm yet impossibly commanding, filled the room. Time is irrelevant to comprehension. Every observer, every decision, every possibility is now aligned, woven into the lattice. What is seen leaves a mark, and every mark endures. There is no erasure. There is only consequence. A faint vibration pulsed through the cellar, as if reality itself acknowledged the truth. The observers felt it in their instincts, their thoughts, their perceptions. The alignment was permanent. The knowledge they had inherited could never be shed. Every choice they would make from this moment forward would carry echoes of the lattice, echoes of her mastery. She smiled faintly, knowingly. Not triumph, not malice, just comprehension. The ritual was complete. The chain, the shadows, the currents, the lattice, they had all converged into a single axis. She was its fulcrum, and through her, its influence would persist beyond time, beyond observation, beyond comprehension itself. Blackthorn whispered one final time, voice heavy with awe and dread. She exists, and everything that touches her comprehension is forever changed. The consequence beyond time was absolute. Mastery had a cost, a ripple, a permanence that no mind could undo. Knowledge had become alignment, alignment had become inevitability, and inevitability had become eternal. Every witness would carry it, subtly, inescapably, for the rest of their lives, and in that subtlety lay the true, terrifying power of forbidden comprehension.